The turkey was on sale, marked down to half price, because the package had a small dent on one side, and Ethan Carter held it in both arms like it was something precious, which, to him, it was. He stood in the frozen foods aisle of the discount grocery store at the edge of town. His work boots, still damp from 8 hours of loading freight in a warehouse where the heating unit had been broken for 2 weeks, and he calculated silently in his head the way he always did. Turkey, a string of clearance, Christmas lights, the little box of sugar cookies Lily had been eyeing since Thanksgiving. He could make it work. He always made it work, even when the numbers told him otherwise. Outside, snow was falling in that particular way it does on Christmas Eve. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just steady and indifferent. And Ethan zipped his jacket up to his chin and walked to the register with exactly what he had budgeted for, not one item more. The drive home took 14 minutes. He knew every crack in that road, every pothole the city had promised to fix for 3 consecutive winters. The truck his father had left him was old enough to have its own personality. The heater worked on the driver's side only, and the radio stuck permanently on a country station he didn't particularly like, but it ran. And that was enough. When he pulled into the narrow driveway of the house he rented on Clover Street, the lights were already on and he could see Lily's silhouette moving past the window, small and quick, and something in his chest loosened just a little. He sat for exactly 3 seconds before getting out, those 3 seconds being the only private moment he would allow himself, and then he was out of the truck, turkey under one arm, paper bag of groceries in the other, smiling the way fathers learn to smile, wide enough to mean it, steady enough to hold. Lily Carter was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, which meant Ethan could never quite look directly at her for too long without feeling a particular kind of grief that had no clean name. But she was also entirely herself, practical, funny, with a habit of explaining things as if she were already the adult in the room. And she had spent the afternoon making Christmas decorations out of things she'd found around the house. Paper chains from old grocery bags, painted with red and green markers. A star cut from the cardboard backing of a legal pad. Tinsel fashioned from aluminum foil twisted into long strips that she'd draped over the doorframe with considerable architectural pride. When Ethan walked in, she was standing on a kitchen chair, attempting to hang a paper snowflake from the ceiling light fixture, and she turned around with that particular expression. She had half grin, half "you're late but I'll let it go," and said, "I already started. I hope that's okay." He told her it was more than okay. He told her it was perfect. And he almost meant it completely. They cooked together in the small kitchen where one burner worked better than the others. Lily stirring the canned cranberry sauce with ceremonial seriousness. Ethan managing the turkey with the focused attention of a man who understood that this meal had to count. The apartment smelled like rosemary and butter, and, faintly, like the pine candle Lily had found at a church rummage sale and insisted on burning only on special occasions. She had declared this a special occasion. She was not wrong. Somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the warm surface of the evening, Ethan was running calculations again. The overdue electric bill, the notice from the property management company, the number he still owed to Victor Hale's collection firm, a number that had been growing quietly for months like something alive and patient. He did not let any of this reach his face. He asked Lily about her week at school, and she told him, at length and with considerable detail, about a disagreement between 2 of her classmates involving a borrowed eraser and deeply hurt feelings. And he listened to all of it with his full attention, the way he had promised himself he always would. Later, when the turkey was resting, and Lily was sitting on the floor arranging the paper chain so it draped just so around the base of the small plastic tree they'd used for 3 years running, she looked up at him with those eyes and said, simply, and without any particular preamble, "I don't need a lot of presents, Dad. I just need it to be us." Ethan turned toward the counter. Before she could see what happened to his face, he straightened a dish. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the window where the snow was still falling, indifferent and steady. And he told himself that this was enough, that this right here was the whole point, and he almost entirely believed it. Earlier that week, his neighbor Carl had stopped him on the front step and said, low and serious, The way men talk when they're trying to be kind about something unkind. I don't know what you owe that Hale guy, but whatever it is, find a way out. He's not the kind of man who lets things go quietly. Ethan had nodded. He'd heard the warnings. He just hadn't found the door yet. It was 3 days before Christmas Eve when Ethan first saw the old couple outside the Millbrook Grocery on 5th Street. He almost didn't stop. He was already late, had a second shift, starting at 4, and the grocery run was supposed to take 20 minutes, but the woman was standing at the self-checkout, with her hands pressed flat on the counter, and the look on her face was one he recognized immediately, the look of someone doing arithmetic in their head that isn't adding up correctly. Her husband stood slightly behind her, one hand on a small cart, the other in the pocket of a coat that had been good once, maybe a decade ago. The machine was rejecting the card. The cashier, a teenager with the particular helplessness of someone who has no authority to fix the problem, kept trying to be reassuring. And the woman kept nodding, and the line behind them was growing impatient in that quiet, Christmas-time way that pretended not to be impatient. Ethan stepped forward. He told the cashier to add the couple's items to his total. The woman turned to look at him and said, "Oh, absolutely not, young man," with the precise inflection of someone who means it, and also, immediately, does not mean it. He paid. He told her it wasn't a big deal, which was not entirely honest, since the $53 he'd just absorbed would require some creative rearranging of his week. But he'd done it before. The man who introduced himself as Walter, his wife as Evelyn, shook Ethan's hand with both of his and held it for a moment longer than expected, as if he were measuring something. Evelyn looked at Ethan's work jacket, at the warehouse badge, still clipped to his chest, at the economical choices in his own cart. And she said nothing, but her expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read. They talked in the parking lot for 15 minutes. Walter and Evelyn Brooks were in their mid-70s, recently relocated to a small house on the north end of Clover Street, Ethan's own street. It turned out after, as Walter explained it, a run of particularly bad luck with some financial arrangements. Their house needed work. The gutters were pulling away from the roofline. One section of the front porch had developed an unsettling lean, and an interior fuse had blown that left the kitchen without power. Ethan, without making a production of it, asked if he could come by that Saturday. He had some tools. He knew a little about electrical panels. It was no trouble. Walter watched him offer this with an expression that Ethan couldn't quite categorize: attentive, almost studying, and said yes, they would be grateful, and thank you, and please bring your daughter if she'd like to come. She did. Lily brought her homework and sat at their kitchen table doing multiplication while Ethan climbed a ladder in the cold. And when he came down, Evelyn had made hot cocoa for all of them and set out a plate of cookies that she explained she'd baked that morning from a very old recipe, the kind of cookies that taste like someone's grandmother made them because someone's grandmother did. That afternoon was the beginning of something, though none of them named it. Ethan came back the following weekend to finish the gutters. The weekend after that, he split firewood and stacked it by the back door because the forecast was calling for heavy snow, and Walter's back made certain tasks difficult. Each time, Evelyn found a reason to ask him something, a question that seemed small but lingered afterward, the kind of question that seems like conversation but is actually something else. One evening, as Ethan was packing up his tools, she asked, standing at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a mug, "If you came into a great deal of money suddenly, more than you'd expected, more than you needed, what would you do with it?" He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about most things, without performing. He said, "Make sure Lily's got what she needs for the future. And then I'd probably sleep for about 2 days." Evelyn smiled at the window. Walter, seated at the table behind them, wrote something in the small notebook he always seemed to carry. The one Ethan had assumed was for grocery lists or medication schedules or the other administrative work of old age. What Ethan did not notice, or rather, noticed and filed away without assigning meaning, was the small, dark eye of a camera mounted on the smoke detector in the hallway. He'd helped install that smoke detector himself. Third visit, after Walter mentioned the original one had stopped working. He'd bought the replacement with a $20 bill from his own pocket, and told Walter it was on sale. There was also a camera in the living room, positioned inside a decorative clock on the mantel, but that one he hadn't touched. So he had no particular reason to look at it carefully. And there was a white van parked 2 houses down from the Brooks residence that had been there for several weeks. Its windows dark, its presence unremarkable in the way that panel vans in residential neighborhoods tend to be unremarkable present but invisible, like furniture. Victor Hale had been in the business of collecting debt for 22 years, which meant he had developed, over time, a philosophy about it. The philosophy was simple. People who owe money are people who have already demonstrated some fundamental weakness of character, and the debt itself is merely the evidence. He ran Hale Capital Solutions from a glass office on the 14th floor of a downtown building, employed 31 people, drove a car that cost more than most of those employees earned in a year, and genuinely believed not as performance, but as actual conviction that what he did was a social function, a corrective mechanism, a form of accountability that the soft-hearted could not provide. He had, over his career, seen people cry, beg, collapse into chairs, offer things that were not his to take. He found none of this particularly affecting. He sometimes found it tedious. Ethan Carter's debt file was not large. It was a medical debt, originally, transferred twice, through different collection agencies, until it landed on Victor's desk, the accumulated cost of his wife's final 8 months of treatment, after their insurance reached its maximum, and the appeals ran out, and the only remaining option was to keep paying until the account was empty, and then borrow against the future they'd been saving for. His wife's name had been Sarah, and she had died on a Thursday in February, 3 years ago, with Lily asleep in a chair by the window and Ethan holding her hand. And the hospital bill that arrived 6 weeks later was so large that Ethan had, for a moment, simply stood in the kitchen holding the envelope and been unable to move. He'd been paying what he could. Victor Hale did not consider what he could to be sufficient. Victor drove to Ethan's job site on a Tuesday, specifically because Ethan's supervisor had mentioned, when Victor's assistant called to confirm his schedule, that Tuesdays were when the whole crew was there. He wanted an audience. He walked onto the loading dock in a coat that cost $3,000 and spoke loudly, in the way of a man who understands that public humiliation is the most efficient tool in a debt collector's arsenal. He called Ethan delinquent. He called him irresponsible. He used words that were technically about finance but functionally about character, about worth, about the kind of person who fails to meet his obligations. Ethan's co-workers stopped what they were doing. Ethan stood with his hands at his sides and said, quietly and without raising his voice, that he was aware of the balance and was doing everything he could. And could they please discuss this in private? Victor said no. He didn't think that was necessary, and then he explained, still loudly, the legal options available to him, the lien he could place on assets, the wage garnishment he could pursue, the timeline. He said, "Men like you always think someone's going to come save them. Nobody's coming, Carter." Then he left. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed and looked at the stack of papers in the folder he kept in the drawer beneath the dish towels. The folder he called. In his head, the situation. He looked at the numbers for a long time. He did not cry. He had a very strict policy about when he allowed himself to cry, which was only after Lily was asleep, and only occasionally, and only when there was genuinely no other available response to what he was feeling. He did not meet those criteria that night. He simply sat, and the kitchen was quiet except for the wind against the window. And after a while, he closed the folder and put it back in the drawer and went to check that Lily's blankets were properly tucked. She was sleeping with her arm around a stuffed rabbit that had been her mother's idea of a joke, a rabbit named Sirius, and her face in sleep was so completely peaceful that Ethan stood in the doorway for a full minute just looking before he went to bed himself. What he did not know, could not have known, was that earlier that day, across town, Walter Brooks had been on a phone call with a production team. He'd said, simply and precisely, the way people speak when they are accustomed to being listened to. He held up again. Same result. Stage 3, complete. Prepare the final sequence. In the white van outside the Brooks house, 3 technicians were reviewing footage on monitors, cross-referencing timestamps, compiling what they described internally as the integrity profile. Evelyn had been keeping her own notes, which she wrote in a small leather journal, with her initials embossed on the cover, not the domestic journal it appeared to be, but a professional one, the record of a woman who had been doing this work for a very long time and still took it seriously. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, Ethan set the table for 4. He'd borrowed 2 extra chairs from Carl next door, arranged them with some care, and put a candle in the center that Lily had insisted upon the pine one, which she decreed was appropriate for a special occasion. And this, she announced with some authority, was definitely a special occasion. The turkey had been cooking since noon. The apartment smelled extraordinary, which surprised even Ethan, given the limitations of the equipment. Lily had made a card for each of them, one for her father, drawn with a precision she brought to most creative work, featuring a large tree and 2 figures of noticeably different heights. One for Walter, which included a small drawing of a hammer because, she explained, that was how she thought of him, and one for Evelyn, which had flowers, because flowers seemed right. She'd placed them at each setting as if she'd been hosting Christmas dinners her whole life. Walter and Evelyn arrived at 5 o'clock. Walter carrying a bottle of sparkling cider, and Evelyn carrying a pie she'd made that morning, lemon, which turned out to be Lily's second favorite after pecan. They sat. Evelyn looked at the paper chain, the foil tinsel, the hand-lettered cards, the candle burning steadily in the center of the table, and her eyes filled in a way she didn't bother to hide. She had seen many things in the course of her work. She had watched people in their most unguarded moments, had observed human beings at their best and their worst, and all the grades in between. But there was something about this particular table, this particular effort assembled from so little, that moved her in a way that felt less professional and more fundamental. Walter placed his hand over hers on the table and she nodded, just barely, and he sent a text from his phone to a number saved simply as control that read, "Final phase. Proceed when ready." Ethan raised his glass of cider and said he wanted to say something before they ate. And then he said it, that this year had been one of the harder ones, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, because pretending was exhausting and he was tired of it. But sitting here, with Lily, with the 2 of them, he gestured to Walter and Evelyn with his glass. He felt something he hadn't felt in a while, which was that things might eventually be all right, and that was worth celebrating, and he was grateful. Walter said, "To things being all right." And they touched glasses. And Lily said, with great conviction, "Cheers," which she had clearly been waiting to say. The food was good. The lemon pie was excellent. For 45 minutes, the apartment on Clover Street was exactly what Ethan had been trying to make it: warm, small, full. The door came open with enough force to bang against the wall. Victor Hale did not knock. He was not the kind of man who announced himself at doors. He walked in with 2 associates behind him, both of them holding phones that were already recording, and he looked at the table and the people at it, and the whole decorated scene with an expression of complete contempt. Not performed contempt, not theatrical contempt, but the genuine, reflexive kind that comes from a person who has, over many years, practiced looking at other people's lives and finding them inadequate. "Well," he said, loud enough to fill the room entirely, "isn't this something? Look at this place." He walked further in. One of his associates panned his phone slowly around the apartment, capturing the paper chain, the foil tinsel, the plastic tree. Victor laughed, and it was the particular laugh of someone sharing a joke only they are privy to. Lily had gone completely still. Children develop, early, a very precise sensor for threat, and hers had activated the moment the door opened. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on her father's face, looking for the signal that would tell her how frightened to be. Ethan had pushed back from the table and stood. He was not a small man, but he was also not a man who led with his body, and the energy he was projecting at that moment was the very controlled, very deliberate energy of someone who has made a decision about how this is going to go, and is holding that decision with both hands. "This is a private home," he said. "You need to leave." Victor said he would leave when he was good and ready, which would be after he had what he came for, which was a signed document of debt acknowledgement and a commitment to the new repayment schedule that he had unilaterally restructured in terms significantly less favorable than the previous one. He placed the papers on the table. Several items shifted. The lemon pie in its dish slid several inches. Then he moved toward Lily's chair. It was not entirely clear whether it was deliberate, whether the kick that sent her chair skidding backward was intentional, or the result of Victor not bothering to track where he was putting his feet, because people like Lily simply did not register as obstacles to him. The effect was the same. The chair went back. Lily grabbed the edge of the table. Her card, the one she'd drawn for her father, the one with the two figures of different heights standing beneath the tree, fluttered to the floor. Victor did not look at her. He reached across the table and swept his arm sideways, and the turkey platter went off the edge and hit the floor with a sound that was both very loud and somehow also very final. The cranberry sauce followed, the bowl of mashed potatoes that Lily had stirred so seriously, all of it on the floor, and the room was suddenly very different from what it had been 60 seconds earlier. Lily cried. She didn't make a large sound. She was too shocked, or too proud, or too much her father's daughter for that, but her face crumpled in a way that was entirely uncontrolled, and her shoulders came up around her ears. And she made a small, choked sound that was worse, in some ways, than open sobbing. Ethan moved toward her first. He put himself between her and Victor, and he stood there with his hands at his sides, trembling with something that was not fear, and he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, "Whatever you need to do it to me. Do not look at her. Do not speak to her. Do not go near her." Victor looked at him with what might have been mild interest and said, touching, "Sign the papers, Carter." He then turned his attention to Walter, who had not moved from his seat, and told him that the matter of his property and associated debt would be addressed simultaneously and that he should produce whatever documentation he had available. Walter produced his phone instead. He set it on the table with the screen facing Victor, and the screen was showing a live feed, a split screen, actually multiple camera angles simultaneously, all of them showing this room, this table, this moment, from angles that Victor could now identify as the smoke detector in the hallway, the clock on the mantel, and a fourth camera he hadn't located yet. He looked at the screen for a long moment, then looked up at Walter. Walter said nothing. Evelyn, seated beside him, folded her hands on the table with the composure of someone who has spent decades in rooms where things are about to happen. She looked at Victor with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely devastating, and she said, "Please continue, Mr. Hale. We have all the time in the world." Victor's phone, in his jacket pocket, buzzed. Then buzzed again. Then began buzzing in a rhythm that suggested it had received a very large number of notifications in a very short period of time. He did not reach for it yet. He was still looking at the screen. The television on the wall, the old one, the one Ethan had mounted himself with a bracket from the hardware store, had turned on. The logo that appeared was clean and simple, white letters on a dark background. The human test. Below it, a number. The number was updated in real time, and it was, at that moment, climbing past 900,000 viewers and had not finished climbing. Victor Hale looked at the television. He looked at Walter. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the television again. One of his associates, the one still holding his phone, had stopped recording and was now staring at his own screen with an expression of someone reading something they very much did not want to be reading. The other associate had taken a step backward toward the door. Walter Brooks stood up from his chair for the first time since the chaos began, and standing, he was a different kind of presence than sitting still, elderly, still gray-haired, still wearing the coat that had been good once, but upright, deliberate, and carrying the specific gravity of a man who has spent 50 years knowing exactly who he is. He said, addressing the room and the cameras equally, "My name is Walter Brooks. My wife is Evelyn Brooks. Eastless, Wiel, out of line. We are the founders and executive producers of The Human Test, which has been in production for 19 years. Our program operates on a single premise. That character is only legible under pressure. That what people do when the cost is high and the audience, they believe, is zero, that is who they are. He paused. His voice was not raised. You have both just provided very clear evidence of your characters. We are grateful for the clarity. The phones in Victor's associates' hands were both showing the same thing now. The live feed with the viewer counter, the comment stream moving too fast to read individual entries, and in the corner of one screen, a news alert from a financial outlet with Victor's name in the headline. Victor finally reached for his own phone. He looked at it. He read what was on it. He read more of what was on it. His face did not so much fall as drain the color, leaving it the way color leaves a thing when the light source moves, evenly, completely, leaving something pale and strange behind. The comment stream on the broadcast, visible on the television screen, was moving in a solid river of text. This man destroyed a little girl's Christmas dinner. Who is this monster? I'm already looking up his company. Someone tell his board. Is this real? This is real. 3 million watching now. 4 millions. Evelyn had moved to where Lily was sitting, and she had pulled the child gently into her side with the practiced ease of a woman who has grandchildren or has wished for them, and she was speaking softly into the top of Lily's head, words too quiet for the cameras to capture, though they were trying. Ethan was standing very still, watching Victor, and his expression was one of a man trying to understand the nature of the floor beneath him, whether it was going to hold. Walter looked at him, really looked at him. The way he had been looking at him for weeks in smaller increments, and said, quietly enough, that it was a private communication in the midst of a very public moment. This is almost over. Stay with us. Ethan nodded. He didn't fully understand yet, but he nodded. Victor's hands were shaking. He did not often experience this. He said to Walter, "Turn it off." His voice had changed in a way he couldn't prevent. Walter said, mildly and without cruelty, because cruelty was not his instrument. "We don't control the broadcast, Mr. Hale. We provide the circumstances. What people see is what you provided." Victor said, louder, "I can have my lawyers," and Walter said, "I'm certain you can. I'd call them soon. They'll have a great deal to work through." One of the associates had already left. The remaining one put his phone in his pocket and looked at the floor. Victor looked at the television, at the number that was still climbing, at the comment stream, at the logo, and then he looked at the turkey on the floor, and the cranberry sauce soaking into the linoleum, and Lily's card with the 2 figures beneath the tree, lying face down where it had fallen. Something passed across his face that might, in someone else, have been shame. In Victor, it was more like the sensation of a man realizing, for the first time, that a cliff edge is not theoretical. He left without the signed papers. His associate followed him out, and the door was left open behind them, letting in a brief sweep of cold air and the sound of the street, and then silence. The television continued its broadcast. The viewer counter continued its climb. Ethan walked to the open door and closed it, then stood with his hand on the handle for a moment. When he turned around, Evelyn was looking at him, and Walter was looking at him, and Lily was looking at him from the shelter of Evelyn's arm. And the room was quiet, in the way rooms are quiet, after something large has happened, when all the reverberations have settled, but the air still remembers. What happened to Victor Hale's company happened fast, which is the nature of these things now that the instruments of exposure are instantaneous and everywhere. His phone, which he answered in the parking lot outside Ethan's building with hands that had not fully stopped shaking, delivered the news in segments, each one worse than the previous. His largest institutional partner had issued a statement by the time he reached his car. The statement was brief and used words like deeply troubled and immediate review. 3 more partners issued similar statements in the following hour. A former employee, a woman who had worked in Victor's collections department for 4 years, and left after an incident she had described to friends, but never publicly gave a recorded interview to a news outlet that had called her within 20 minutes of the broadcast beginning, and she said, quietly and with great precision, things about the company's internal practices that were difficult to refute because they were documented. The board of Hale Capital Solutions called an emergency session. The session lasted 2 hours. Victor was not invited to the second hour. The video, not just the live broadcast, but the clipped segment that ran from the moment Victor entered to the moment Walter set his phone on the table had been shared across every platform available within 30 minutes of airing. It had been viewed, by the next morning, a number difficult to comprehend in the abstract, but which translated, concretely, into something Ethan would understand only gradually over the following days, that there was almost no one left in the country who had not seen what had happened at his kitchen table on Christmas Eve. The reactions sorted themselves, as reactions always do, into the predictable categories: the outraged, the moved, the analytical, the performatively heartbroken. But even accounting for the noise, something real had passed through the broadcast, something that struck people at a register below argument. A father standing between his daughter and a man with power, a child's drawing on the floor. A very old couple sitting calmly while a storm moved through. Victor was escorted from the Hale Capital Solutions building the following morning by security, his own security, a detail he had always found the mention of gratifying and which now had a different quality entirely. He walked to his car through a lobby where no one looked at him directly. He had already been told what the board had decided. His lawyers had begun conversations with the regulatory bodies that had been watching Hale Capital for some time, waiting for something they could attach to. They had found it. The process would be long and expensive and deeply unpleasant, and at the end of it, the company that bore his name would look substantially different than the one he had built, and he would not be running it. In the parking garage, alone, Victor Hale sat in his expensive car and looked at the steering wheel for a very long time. What he was feeling, he could not have said precisely. It was not remorse, exactly. It was something closer to the experience of a man who has spent his entire life certain of the rules of a game and has just discovered that he was the only one playing by them. On Christmas morning, Walter and Evelyn returned to the house on Clover Street. Ethan had spent much of the night cleaning the kitchen floor, and Lily had helped for a while before falling asleep on the couch with Sirius the rabbit, and he had carried her to bed and then gone back to finish cleaning alone, and it had taken some time, but eventually the kitchen was clean again, and he had sat at the table afterward in the early morning quiet and thought about the word test, what it meant to have been tested without knowing it, and whether he would have done anything differently if he had known, and whether knowing changes the doing, and he had concluded, with some certainty, that it does not. He had done what he did because it was what was available to him. He had helped Walter and Evelyn because they had needed help, and he had been there. He had stood in front of his daughter because she was his daughter. None of this had required intention beyond the immediate. He wasn't sure what that meant about character, but it seemed like something. Walter sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same table, now clean, the candle replaced, a new paper chain Lily had made that morning while her father slept briefly on the couch, and he spoke plainly. The way Ethan had come to understand was Walter's mode of operation, directness carried not as bluntness but as respect. He said that the human test had been running for 19 years, that it worked by identifying individuals who had not been identified people in ordinary circumstances, not celebrities or executives or people who had any reason to perform goodness for an audience, but people going about their lives in the particular pressure of genuine difficulty, that Ethan had been one of several hundred people observed over the previous 6 months, and that he was the only one whose record across every scenario, not one, not three, but every single one, had been consistent. Walter said this without drama, as a fact. And it landed on Ethan, as facts land, when they are simultaneously ordinary and very large. Ethan said, "I don't understand." Walter said, "Which part?" Ethan said, "Any of it, really. I wasn't doing anything. I was just doing what seemed like the right thing to do." Walter said, "Yes, that is precisely the remarkable part. There had been a morning, 6 weeks earlier, when Ethan had found a wallet in the warehouse parking lot, gone through it to find ID, and driven it across town to return it to its owner, a 40-minute detour that made him late to his second job. The cameras had followed him on that trip, though he hadn't known. There had been an afternoon when a coworker was being pressured by a supervisor in a way that was close enough to the line that no one said anything, and Ethan had said something, quietly, just to the supervisor, Afterward in private, not to make himself look good but because the coworker was young and had been shaking. The cameras had been there too. There had been a cold evening when he'd given his lunch to a man sitting outside the warehouse entrance. Not a grand gesture, not advertised, just a turkey sandwich from a brown bag, passed over without ceremony, while he kept walking. He had not thought about any of these things as being observed. He had not thought about them at all, beyond doing them. They had simply been, in the language of his daily life, what was in front of him. Evelyn said to Lily, who was sitting beside her eating a piece of toast with the quiet contentment of a child who has had a strange night and is recovering through the simple machinery of butter and bread, "You have a remarkable father." Lily looked at her and then looked at her father and said, "I know," with a confidence that was not performed and not boasted, but simply stated, the way you state the color of the sky, or the name of the street you live on. Ethan looked at his daughter, and the thing that happened to his face was not something he tried to control or could have. Walter, watching, looked briefly away, giving him the privacy of the moment, without drawing attention to the gesture. The details of what the Brooks Foundation offered Ethan Carter were presented in a document that Walter placed on the table in a plain manila envelope, and Ethan read it twice before saying anything. The first thing they offered was the house, a 3-bedroom property on Meadow Lane, owned outright by the foundation, which they intended to gift, not loan, with clear title, no obligation. The second was an educational trust, in Lily's name, sufficient to cover 4 years of college at any institution she chose, plus a supplement for graduate study if she wanted it. The third was a position, Director of Outreach for the Brooks Charitable Foundation, overseeing a program that connected people in financial crisis with resources, legal aid, and employment support, a job that paid a salary. Ethan read 3 times because the number seemed like an error, and then Walter confirmed it was correct. Ethan sat for a long time. He said, "Why me?" It was not quite a question. Walter treated it as one. He said, "Because we were looking for someone who, when there was no reason left to be good, chose goodness anyway. You didn't know you were being watched. You didn't know there was anything to gain. You just kept going. That is extraordinarily difficult to find." Ethan looked at the document, and then out the window, where the snow from the night before was lying still and clean on every surface. He said, "I have to think about this." Walter said he had all the time he needed. He did not, of course, need very long. What Lily remembered most about that Christmas morning, later years later, when she was old enough to describe it to people and have them understand, was not the revelation of the cameras, or the name of the show, or the collapse of Victor Hale's company, details that she had processed in the partial and selective way that children process large events. What she remembered was her father's face when he put the document down on the table, not the way it looked when he'd been crying, because she'd seen that before, always after she was supposed to be asleep, always when he thought she couldn't tell, not the careful, controlled look he wore through the hard days, but something else, something she didn't have an exact word for at the time, though she looked for one, a loosening, a kind of unfastening, as if something he'd been holding very tightly for a very long time had been set down, and he was just standing there, empty-handed, noticing that his arms didn't hurt anymore. She went to him and he held her for a long time, and neither of them said anything. And outside the window the snow was white and still, and the morning was very quiet. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, the house on Meadow Lane was full in a way that no house Ethan had lived in had ever been full. He'd been planning it for weeks, not as an event, not as a gesture for an audience, but because the year had changed things for him in ways both obvious and subtle, and one of the things it had changed was his understanding of what a table is for. He'd reached out through his work at the foundation to families in the neighborhood. The single mother on Oak Street with 3 kids and a heating system that had been failing since October. The 2 brothers who'd lost their jobs in the same month and were staying temporarily with a cousin on the East Side. The elderly man from the community center who had nowhere to go on Christmas and had told Ethan this in passing one afternoon, without complaint, as a simple fact of his situation. He'd reached out to others too, people he knew from the warehouse, from the shelter run on 4th Street, from the network of people who had, over the previous year, become connected to Ethan in the way people become connected to someone who has a gift for paying attention. The table was long. He'd borrowed folding tables from the community center and arranged them end to end through the living room and into the dining area, and it was covered in food that smelled the way Christmas is supposed to smell, the warmth of it reaching the front door. Lily moved through it all with the assurance of a child who has been given responsibility. She is fully capable of meeting, refilling glasses, introducing people who didn't know each other, showing the younger kids the tree that she and her father had decorated with a combination of old paper chains and new ones, kept deliberately unmatching because she had explained with considerable authority that was the right way to do it. At some point during the evening, a man named Douglas, quiet, large, someone who had come with the brothers from Oak Street and hadn't said much since arriving, reached across the table for the bread basket and knocked it sideways, sending rolls across the cloth and one onto the floor, and froze with the specific stillness of a man waiting to be told what he already fears about himself. Ethan was already moving, not to correct, not to make a thing of it, but simply to pick up the roll and put the basket back and keep talking. As if the only thing that had happened was a thing that could easily be set right. Which it could, and was. He said, catching Douglas's eye for just a moment. Happens to me all the time. These baskets are poorly designed. Douglas let out a breath that was longer than the situation required. He picked up his glass of cider. He stayed for another 2 hours. Across town, in a comfortable house with very large windows, Walter and Evelyn Brooks watched a feed on a large screen. Not surveillance. They were done with that particular kind of watching. This was simply the television news, which had, as part of its holiday programming, run a segment on the 1-year anniversary of the broadcast, including footage of Ethan's Christmas dinner tonight, filmed by a crew he'd invited because he'd decided that transparency was what he had to offer, and it was worth offering. Walter had his arm around Evelyn, and she was watching the screen with the expression of a woman who has been in a demanding profession for a very long time and has learned not to expect too much from it, and who is therefore, in this moment, surprised. Not by the outcome. They had designed the system carefully, and Ethan was exactly who they'd believed him to be, but by the particular quality of what was on the screen. A long table, many people, a child moving easily through a crowd of strangers, a man whose posture had changed in a year, not straighter, exactly, but less braced, less prepared for impact. Evelyn said, softly, not to the cameras or the broadcast or the viewer counter, but to the room and her husband, and possibly to something larger than either, "We found the right one." Walter said nothing. He raised his glass. She raised hers. The snow that fell on Meadow Lane that night was the same snow that fell everywhere, indifferent, steady, the particular snowfall of a Christmas Eve that doesn't know or care what the people inside the houses are feeling. But inside the house at the end of the lane, inside the long room full of mismatched chairs and borrowed tables, and the smell of something good, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system, which was, for the record, excellent. Ethan Carter had not become a different man. He had simply been given the room to be the man he already was. And the room made all the difference. He stood at the head of that long table and looked down its length at all the people who had come, some because they'd been invited, some because a friend had mentioned it, some because they'd heard and needed somewhere to be, and he did not make a speech. He just picked up his glass and waited until the room quieted, which it did, the way rooms do when someone patient waits. And then he said, "Merry Christmas," and that was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. There is a particular kind of wealth that has nothing to do with the numbers in an account, or the quality of the car in the driveway, or the square footage of the rooms one moves through. It is not measured in the currency that Victor Hale had spent his career believing was the only measure of a person's value. It is the wealth of a man who, when everything had been taken from him, and the taking was still ongoing, and there was no audience, and no reward, and no reason beyond his own sense of what was right, chose still to extend a hand, to give a lunch, to return a wallet, to stand between something small and something that threatened it. The richest person in any room is not the one who has accumulated the most. It is the one who, having lost almost everything, finds that there is still something left of themselves that they would not trade for any of it. Ethan Carter had been that person in the warehouse parking lot, and in the grocery store, and in the cold with a stack of firewood, and at a kitchen table on Christmas Eve with his hands trembling and his daughter behind him. He had been that person when no one was watching, which is the only time it counts. And when the watching finally came, there was nothing to hide, which is the only kind of life that can bear the light.